This photograph was captured in 1871 inside the Danvers State Hospital in Massachusetts. The young girl in the image is Catherine Doyle, just 9 years old, but take a closer look at her face. Look at those eyes, the stiffness in her posture, and that strange expression that seems far too mature and haunting for a child. Catherine Doyle defied everything that doctors of the Victorian age believed about the human mind. Her case remains unsolved even after more than 1.5 centuries. The photograph before you holds one of the most chilling and mysterious medical puzzles of the 19th century. What happened to this little girl still cannot be explained by modern medicine. It cannot be clarified by psychology, and perhaps it will never be truly understood. The story you're about to hear isn't just a medical case. It's something much deeper, something that pushes the limits of what we understand as human reality. To make sense of what happened to Catherine Doyle, we must travel back to the world of 1871. America was still healing from the scars left by the Civil War, which had ended only 6 years before. Boston was a city going through massive change, filled with Irish immigrants fleeing hunger and hopelessness back home, searching for new beginnings across the ocean. Psychiatry at that time was in its earliest and cruelest form. Asylums were gloomy, isolated institutions where anyone labeled mentally unwell was hidden away from the world. There was little understanding of mental illness, psychology, or the minds of children. People who didn't fit society's idea of normality were simply locked up and forgotten. Danvers State Hospital, where Catherine would spend her final years, was one of those bleak and dreaded places. Built on old farmland once tied to Salem, it carried not just the burden of outdated medicine, but also the lingering darkness of American history. The corridors of that building had witnessed what we would now consider barbaric treatments: long cold baths, cruel restraints, complete isolation, and experiments that today would be seen as horrifying. In this grim and limited medical world, Catherine Doyle became one of the most documented and unsettling psychiatric cases of her century. The doctors then, even if they meant well, simply lacked the understanding or technology to grasp what they were witnessing. Catherine was born on March 15, 1862 in Boston. She was the daughter of Patrick and Mary Doyle, Irish immigrants who had crossed the Atlantic in search of a better life. Patrick worked at the busy Boston docks, loading and unloading ships filled with goods from distant ports. Mary worked as a domestic helper in some of Beacon Hill's grand homes, cleaning and cooking for the wealthy families of the city. The Doyles lived in a tiny 2-room apartment in the North End, a neighborhood mostly filled with Irish families. Life there was poor and crowded, but the people shared strong faith, tight community bonds, and the comfort of familiar traditions. Catherine grew up hearing the Irish language from elderly neighbors, smelling the scent of freshly baked bread from local shops, and listening to her grandmother's stories of old Ireland. According to parish records and family accounts, Catherine was an ordinary and healthy child through her first 7 years. She was playful, curious, and bright for her age, but typical for her time and background. She loved her rag dolls sewn by her mother, helped with simple chores, and attended Sunday Mass at St. Leonard's Church, where she learned her first prayers in Latin. Her teachers described her as diligent, not extraordinary, but attentive and well-behaved. She learned to read and write at a normal pace, enjoyed Bible stories, and had many friends among her classmates. There was nothing at all that hinted at the strange events that would later change her life forever. Mary often told doctors that Catherine had been a gentle, kind-hearted child who loved helping in the kitchen and worried about her father's safety at work. Patrick would call her the light of our home, the one who brought joy into their small apartment and made poverty bearable. But everything changed in September 1869. What happened during that month remains debated by scholars even today. On the morning of September 14, 1869, a Tuesday that Mary Doyle would never forget, her daughter woke up different. Not in appearance. She still looked the same, with her freckled face and curly brown hair, but something deep within her had changed. It was as though an unseen switch had been turned inside her. The first signs were subtle. She woke later than usual, though she was normally an early riser. When she finally came to the table for breakfast, her movements were slow and deliberate, like she was thinking through each gesture before making it. And instead of cheerfully greeting her parents as always, she sat down silently, staring at them with eyes that seemed both empty and strangely ancient. When her mother asked if she was unwell, Catherine answered, but her tone was off. Her voice had a deeper, rougher texture, almost as though it belonged to someone older. In the weeks that followed, her transformation became impossible to ignore. Catherine started showing knowledge that no 7-year-old could possibly have known. She spoke casually about historic events, describing the American Revolution as if she had lived through it. She mentioned specific battle names, leaders, and outcomes that weren't taught in her small parish school. She also quoted ancient Greek philosophers like Aristotle and Plato, not as memorized lines but with actual understanding, as though she truly grasped the meaning behind those ideas. When her confused father asked how she knew such things, she would simply smile, a cold, unsettling smile, and say that she had always known them. Her knowledge of religion also changed. She could suddenly recite long, obscure passages from the Bible in Latin, verses that even priests rarely remembered by heart. When Father O'Brien from St. Leonard's tested her, he found himself astonished. She could discuss deep theological questions with the sophistication of a trained scholar. But her uncanny intelligence was not the only thing that worried her parents. Catherine began revealing secrets about their neighbors, private matters she could not have possibly known. She mentioned hidden debts, infidelities, and personal troubles with eerie accuracy, leaving everyone unsettled. Then came her fascination with death and pain. She began asking disturbing questions about how people died, details that no child should ever dwell on. She talked about torture methods, ancient executions, and diseases in precise and graphic terms. Sometimes she described these things with a strange pleasure in her eyes, as though she enjoyed speaking about suffering. It wasn't the innocent curiosity of a child. It was darker, sharper, and deeply unnerving. She also started harming herself, scratching her arms and face until she bled, biting her lips raw, and hitting her head against the wall. The most terrifying part was that she didn't seem to feel pain. In fact, she appeared calm, almost euphoric, during these acts. When her mother tried to stop her, Catherine would find new ways to continue. If scolded or questioned, she would calmly say that something told her to do it. Animals began to fear her. The stray cats that once followed her around now ran away. Dogs barked at her from a distance, and birds seemed to avoid flying near her. When Mary asked why, Catherine smiled coldly and said, "They know what I am now, Mommy. They're smarter than you." That single sentence terrified her mother more than anything else. As the months went by, Catherine's case became even more frightening. Her physical body began to change in ways no one could explain. She developed unnatural strength. During one episode of anger, she broke an oak chair with her bare hands. Her father examined it and confirmed that such force was impossible for a child. Another time, she left deep finger marks etched into the wooden kitchen table, marks that could not be sanded away. She also became resistant to pain and exhaustion. Once her mother found her standing completely still for hours in the middle of the night, staring blankly at the wall. When asked why she hadn't moved, she simply said she didn't need to. Her tolerance for cold was another strange development. During Boston's bitter winter, she would walk outside wearing nothing but a thin nightgown, unaffected by the freezing air. One night, her father discovered her asleep in the snow, barefoot and peaceful, her skin pale but warm to the touch. But perhaps the most unsettling of all were her eyes. Neighbors began whispering that her gaze could make people feel dizzy or frightened. Some swore that her eyes seemed to change color, brown in daylight, nearly black when she was angry or quiet. People avoided meeting her gaze for too long, afraid of what they might feel. Mary herself began to notice how, during her daughter's strange fits, those once innocent eyes took on a depth and darkness that seemed to stare straight through the soul. By that point, even the most rational people around the family admitted something unexplainable was happening. Doctors, priests, and neighbors offered theories, but none could explain the transformation of the little girl who once laughed and prayed in her mother's kitchen. Catherine Doyle became a mystery that medicine, faith, and reason could not solve. A haunting reminder that some stories from the past remain beyond human understanding. On certain nights, Mary swore she could see faint shapes shifting deep within Catherine's pupils, as if another presence was staring out through her daughter's eyes. As Catherine's behavior grew more disturbing and harder to explain, Patrick and Mary Doyle did what any desperate parents would do. They searched everywhere for help. Being faithful Catholics, their first instinct was to turn to the church. Father Timothy O'Brien of St. Leonard's Church had known Catherine since she was born. He had baptized her, guided her through her first communion, and always saw her as one of the kindest children in his parish. When the Doyles approached him, he was hesitant at first, finding it hard to believe their troubling stories. He assumed it was just a difficult phase many children experienced, perhaps made worse by the fears of loving but anxious parents. That belief vanished the moment Father O'Brien met Catherine in person. During a pastoral visit to the Doyle home in January 1870, he sat with the girl and began talking about simple matters of faith. To his surprise, Catherine not only displayed remarkable knowledge of theology, but also began to question the core beliefs of the church itself, speaking with a logic and sophistication that startled him. He had never heard such arguments, even from well-trained seminary students. What unsettled him even more was when she began revealing details about his own life, things she could not possibly know. She spoke of sins he had confessed only in silence, of hidden doubts about his calling, and even of incidents from his childhood in a quiet Irish village he had never spoken about to anyone in America. When the shaken priest asked how she knew these things, Catherine only smiled faintly and said she simply knew many things about many people. Deeply disturbed, Father O'Brien became convinced that something far beyond medicine or psychology was at work. He decided to perform an exorcism. The ritual took place one cold February night in 1870 inside the Doyle home, witnessed only by the family and an elderly deacon. What happened that night would haunt the priest for the rest of his life. He never spoke of it in public again, though in his private journal, discovered decades later, he described it as the most horrifying experience of his priesthood. During the ceremony, Catherine's behavior didn't match what any religious guide described for the possessed. She showed no pain, no resistance, no screaming or blasphemy. Instead, she laughed, a deep, echoing laugh that seemed to come from several voices all at once. Then, to Father O'Brien's complete horror, Catherine began reciting the words of the exorcism along with him, flawlessly, in Latin, even saying the next lines before he could. Her tone was calm, mocking, and chillingly precise. After the failed ritual, the Doyles turned away from spiritual help and placed their hopes in science, praying that medicine might explain what faith could not. They contacted Dr. Henry Morrison, a well-known Boston physician who specialized in mental disorders. Dr. Morrison had studied in Europe, where newer psychiatric ideas were being developed, and was known for his careful and methodical work. When he first met the Doyles, he believed Catherine's case was a matter of psychology, a gifted but troubled child suffering from emotional trauma. However, that assumption collapsed after his first few sessions with her. Over the course of 2 intense weeks between February and March 1870, Dr. Morrison observed Catherine closely, recording every word and action in meticulous detail. His notes, which are still preserved in Boston's historical medical archives, remain among the most unsettling documents in medical history. From the very start, he recognized that Catherine possessed an intelligence far above her age level, yet her interests seemed fixed only on grim and disturbing topics. She could discuss human anatomy with the precision of a medical student, describe the symptoms of rare illnesses, and even recommend treatments that were considered experimental for the time. During their sessions, Catherine often drew or wrote on paper. Yet what she created were not the innocent sketches of a child. No flowers, houses, or animals. Instead, she drew detailed, anatomically correct skeletons, decaying bodies, and people twisted in unnatural poses of pain. Her drawings were technically impressive, almost impossibly so for a young girl with no formal artistic training. Dr. Morrison found her writings even more remarkable and unsettling. She wrote easily in several languages she had never studied: Latin, ancient Greek, and even a basic form of Egyptian hieroglyphs. When he questioned how she learned them, she replied simply that the words appeared in her mind when she needed them. But what disturbed Dr. Morrison most of all were Catherine's eyes. In his notes, he wrote at length about the uneasy feeling he had when she stared directly at him. It was as though an intelligence far older and far more experienced was studying him in return. He described the sensation as profoundly uncomfortable, as if he were being judged by something that saw through every layer of his thoughts. The doctor also recorded strange physical anomalies during his examinations. Catherine's body temperature remained consistently lower than normal, yet she showed no signs of coldness or illness. Her heartbeat was unusually slow but perfectly steady. Even more inexplicably, plants in the office began to wilt whenever she spent too long inside, though every environmental condition stayed exactly the same. The final event that forced the Doyles to send Catherine to Danvers State Hospital occurred on an especially bitter February night in 1870. It was the moment when disbelief finally gave way to fear, convincing even skeptics that something truly unexplainable was happening. Around 3 a.m, Patrick Doyle awoke suddenly with the uneasy sense that something was wrong. The house felt too silent, and the air seemed unnaturally cold, even for the harsh Boston winter. He went to check on the family and discovered that Catherine's bed was empty. After searching every room, he finally looked out through the kitchen window and froze. There, in the center of the snow-covered backyard, stood a small figure, Catherine. She was completely still, wearing only her thin white nightgown, her bare feet buried in the snow. A storm had swept through the city that night, covering everything in thick white drifts, yet Catherine remained standing motionless in the middle of it all. Her arms were outstretched toward the sky, her head tilted back, staring up into the dark clouds as snow gathered on her hair and shoulders. Patrick ran outside, expecting to find her frozen or barely alive. But when he reached her, he was stunned. Catherine wasn't trembling or shivering. Her skin felt as cold as ice, yet her breathing was calm, and she appeared perfectly awake. Slowly, she turned her head toward him, and what he saw made his blood run cold. Her eyes were no longer normal. They were entirely black, not just enlarged pupils, but pure, depthless black, as if the irises and whites had vanished altogether. When she spoke, her voice didn't sound like her own. It carried a strange resonance, as though it came from the air itself. She looked straight into her father's terrified eyes and said words that Patrick would repeat to priests and doctors for the rest of his life. "The stars are almost aligned, Father. When they meet in their rightful place, you will finally see that Catherine never truly existed. She was only the beginning, just preparation for something greater." Patrick stood frozen, unable to move as the storm howled around them. He finally gathered the strength to lift his daughter and bring her back inside. Mary screamed when she saw them, and the rest of the night passed in terrified confusion. At dawn, after hours of desperate discussion between Patrick, Mary, Father O'Brien, and Dr. Morrison, they made the only decision they could. Catherine had to be taken to Danvers State Hospital. The hardest decision the Doyles ever faced had finally been made. Catherine would be sent to Danvers State Hospital. It wasn't a choice made on impulse or without deep pain. Everyone involved understood that what they were dealing with went far beyond their comprehension. Father O'Brien admitted that his prayers and faith alone were not enough to help her. Dr. Morrison confessed that he had never seen anything remotely similar in his entire career, and that only the facilities and expertise of a specialized institution could offer even the slightest hope of understanding Catherine's condition. For Patrick and Mary Doyle, handing over their only daughter to strangers in the name of science felt like tearing away a piece of their souls. Yet they knew they had no other choice. Catherine had become a danger, not only to herself, but to everyone around her. Her displays of unnatural strength, her eerie knowledge of things she couldn't possibly know, and her increasingly disturbing actions had made life at home unbearable and unsafe. Danvers State Hospital was chosen because it was one of New England's most respected centers for the study and treatment of mental disorders. Under the leadership of Dr. Elias Hartwell, it was known for applying modern European psychiatric techniques and maintaining detailed medical records. On the morning of March 15, 1870, 1 year to the day after her 8th birthday, Catherine was taken from her family's Boston home and transported to Danvers. She did not resist or cry. In fact, she behaved with a calmness and understanding far beyond her years, as though she knew exactly what was happening and had accepted it. During the long carriage ride, Catherine sat silently by the window, her eyes fixed on the passing scenery, wearing that same distant and ageless expression that had become her unsettling hallmark. Only once did she speak. Turning toward Dr. Morrison, who accompanied her, she said quietly, "You're going to try to photograph me, aren't you, Doctor? It will be interesting to see what your camera captures." Danvers State Hospital stood as an enormous, intimidating structure built in the Gothic Revival style typical of its time. Perched on a hill that overlooked the Massachusetts countryside, its pointed towers and tall arched windows gave it the appearance of a dark medieval castle rather than a hospital. The institution was founded upon the principles of what was then called moral treatment, a psychiatric theory that claimed patients could be healed through a routine life, productive work, and a peaceful environment. In writing, the approach seemed compassionate and modern. In practice, Danvers had become a place where society abandoned those considered hopeless or too dangerous to live freely. When Catherine arrived in early spring of 1870, more than 600 patients were already crowded inside its walls, living in conditions that today would be considered unbearable. The dim hallways echoed with cries, the clanging of keys and chains, and the murmured ramblings of lost souls, the heavy scent of disinfectant mixed with the foul odors of sweat, decay, and despair. The chief physician, Dr. Elias Hartwell, was a man of 52 who had devoted his life to studying mental illness. A Harvard graduate who had also studied briefly in Paris under leading European psychiatrists, Hartwell saw himself as a progressive thinker committed to careful observation and documentation. When Catherine was brought to his office for the standard intake evaluation, he expected another case of juvenile hysteria or a developmental disorder. He had read Dr. Morrison's notes, but regarded the more extraordinary claims with professional skepticism. That doubt disappeared within minutes of meeting her. When Catherine entered his office, wearing the simple dress she had traveled in, she showed no fear or confusion like most children in new surroundings. Instead, she looked around the room with calculating calm, her gaze analyzing every detail, including the man standing before her. Before Hartwell could begin his examination, Catherine began speaking, naming 3 patients who had died in the hospital within the past month. She told him their full names, the exact dates they had passed, and even intimate details about their final moments, information known only to medical staff and locked away in confidential files. What truly unsettled Hartwell was what came next. Catherine began revealing personal details about his own life, events from his childhood, controversial choices in his medical career, and private matters in his marriage that no one else knew. When the shocked doctor demanded to know how she could possibly know such things, Catherine smiled faintly, that same chilling smile that would later haunt his memories, and answered, "I have my ways of learning about interesting people." Catherine was initially placed in the hospital's children's ward, a small section that housed about 20 young patients with various mental conditions. The ward was under the supervision of Sister Margaret O'Connell, an Irish nun who had spent over 15 years working with troubled children and believed she had seen everything. Catherine's arrival soon proved her wrong. The girl wasn't violent, didn't cause fights, and followed the hospital's basic rules. Yet her presence alone began to change everything. The other children started behaving strangely, though no one could explain why. Within just 1 week, 3 previously stable patients stopped playing, refused to answer questions, and would sit for hours staring blankly at the walls as if watching invisible figures. One of them, 6-year-old Emma Sullivan, who had been admitted after losing her parents in a carriage accident, began speaking constantly about a tall, shadowy woman who she claimed was always present in the room. Emma described her in vivid detail, a towering woman dressed entirely in black, with long dark hair that seemed to move on its own and eyes that looked like dark holes instead of eyes. What terrified the staff most was that all the children who showed these symptoms described the exact same figure in the same way, down to the smallest detail, as though they were all seeing the same unseen being. Sister Margaret at first dismissed it as shared imagination or hysteria, but her doubts grew when the children began talking about things they shouldn't have known. Moments from Catherine's past, private conversations she had had with her parents, and descriptions of the Doyle family's Boston home, a place none of them had ever seen. A 9-year-old boy named Timothy Chen, the son of Chinese immigrants who had been nearly mute since his admission, suddenly began speaking fluently about Catherine's childhood in Ireland. He spoke of relatives who had died before she was even born. The question haunted everyone: how could he possibly know any of it? Before long, the children began moving and acting in unison as though they were following silent commands. They would walk in precise formations, sit in strange geometric patterns during meals, and sometimes chant words in unknown languages none of them had been taught. Dr. Hartwell, observing these eerie behaviors, started to believe that Catherine was somehow influencing the others in ways that science could not yet explain. After 6 weeks of careful observation, Hartwell made the difficult choice to move Catherine into an isolation room, not because she was violent, but because her influence on the others had become too great to ignore. Her new room was on the 3rd floor of the East Wing, a bare, cold cell roughly 3 by 4 meters in size. It contained nothing but a narrow iron bed, a rough wooden table, a chair, and a small bucket. A tiny window with iron bars allowed a narrow beam of daylight to filter in. From that moment on, the focus of her treatment shifted toward deeper study. Dr. Hartwell was determined to understand what was happening inside her mind, and perhaps make discoveries that could change the field of psychiatry forever. Daily sessions with Catherine, however, quickly became unnerving. She didn't behave like a child being questioned by a doctor. Instead, she often guided the conversation herself, turning it toward Hartwell's personal fears and weaknesses. She asked him about his insecurities, about his faith in science, and about the things he regretted most in life. It was as if she could read the thoughts he dared not speak. In one particularly haunting session in May of 1870, she brought up a tragedy from his youth that he had never told a soul: the drowning of a girl named Sarah Mitchell when they were both 12. Catherine described the scene exactly as it had happened. The weather that day, the desperate shouting, and the shame that had followed him ever since. Her words struck him like a knife. But Catherine's knowledge wasn't the worst part. It was the way she used it. She didn't reveal secrets for attention. She used them as tools to manipulate the emotions of everyone she met. She could make people doubt themselves, make them question their own memories, even their sanity. Hartwell began to feel the same uncertainty taking root in his own mind. He recorded everything meticulously, noting other strange phenomena linked to her presence. Her room was always several degrees colder than any other, even when the heating system was working perfectly. Plants placed near her window would die within days. Staff members who spent too long in her room complained of headaches, nausea, and vivid nightmares. 2 guards asked for transfers after claiming they constantly felt watched, even when Catherine appeared to be asleep. Throughout the summer and autumn of 1870, Hartwell conducted a series of experiments far beyond standard medical procedure. He believed Catherine's condition could offer new insight into the deepest mysteries of the mind. He tested her memory, intelligence, and language skills with material far above her age level. She solved complex logic puzzles, discussed philosophy, and answered historical questions that would challenge university students. Her knowledge seemed limitless. Hartwell began showing her photographs of strangers, ancient documents, and texts written in languages long dead. Somehow, she recognized all of them. In one test, he showed her the picture of a man who had died a decade earlier in another state. Without being told anything, she gave the man's full name, described his family, the cause of his death, and even details about his daily habits. Every fact later confirmed as true. Then came something even more unsettling. Catherine began making predictions, quiet, casual remarks about things that hadn't happened yet, and every single one of them came true. She predicted the deaths of 3 specific patients in the hospital, stating not only the exact time they would die, but also the precise circumstances surrounding their deaths. In every instance, her predictions turned out to be completely accurate. While Catherine's mental and supernatural abilities appeared to be growing stronger with time, her physical health began to decline alarmingly during the winter of 1870 to 1871. The deterioration didn't follow any known medical pattern and seemed to be linked in some way to the strange manifestations she exhibited. Catherine started losing weight drastically, even though she maintained what seemed to be a normal appetite. Her skin turned pale, almost transparent, with bluish veins clearly visible beneath the surface. Her hair darkened and thickened, taking on an unusual texture that resembled animal fur more than human hair. Even more unsettling, Catherine began experiencing periods of complete bodily stiffness lasting for several hours. During these spells, she remained as still as a statue, showing no response to any external stimulation. Her heartbeat and breathing stayed regular, yet she didn't blink, move, or answer when spoken to. Dr. Hartwell eventually noticed that these rigid states always coincided with the most intense supernatural activity. During these episodes, the room temperature dropped sharply. Objects moved with greater frequency and strength, and several members of the medical staff reported feeling strange sensations: dizziness, nausea, and a chilling awareness that something unseen was present in the room. Catherine also began speaking during these rigid trances, but her voice changed noticeably from her normal tone. At times, she spoke with several voices at once, creating a haunting harmony that left listeners disoriented. Other times, her voice became deeper and mature, as though an adult personality was speaking through her. During these periods, Catherine revealed information that was even more specific and impossible to explain. She described in exact detail historical events that had taken place centuries before her birth, spoke of people long dead as though she had known them personally, and even predicted future events that always came true. Her predictions during this phase were particularly accurate and unsettling. She foresaw the deaths of well-known political figures, natural disasters with specific dates and locations, and even personal events in the lives of the hospital staff, all of which occurred just as she had foretold. By May of 1871, after more than a year of studying Catherine, Dr. Hartwell made a decision that would forever alter how her case was remembered. He resolved to photograph her as part of his medical documentation. The decision was not made impulsively. Hartwell had noticed that Catherine seemed to appear differently to different people, depending on who was observing her and at what time. Some hospital staff described her as a normal, if pale and thin, young girl. Others saw something deeply unsettling in her appearance, a quality they couldn't define, but that left them uneasy. Hartwell himself had experienced this odd variability. Sometimes Catherine looked simply like an intelligent but troubled 9-year-old. At other times, particularly during her rigid states or her most extraordinary moments, she seemed to embody something far older and far more powerful than a child. Hartwell hoped that a photograph might capture her true image objectively, creating visual evidence that could be studied, compared, and preserved. He also hoped it might reveal details invisible to the naked eye. Medical photography was still relatively new, but it was becoming a valuable tool for documenting psychiatric cases. Some hospitals had started using photography for both identification and research, hoping to find connections between facial expressions and mental conditions. Hartwell reached out to James Thornton, a professional photographer known for his medical portraits and his discretion. Thornton had worked with several psychiatric hospitals in the Boston area and was well respected for his skill and calm approach with unstable patients. When Hartwell explained Catherine's situation, Thornton was intrigued rather than afraid. He had photographed hundreds of psychiatric patients and was familiar with strange or unpredictable behavior. He agreed to take the photograph under controlled conditions using specialized equipment to capture the finest detail possible. The The session was arranged for the morning of June 15, 1871, 15 months after Catherine had arrived at the hospital. Hartwell chose a Thursday morning, as he had observed Catherine was usually calm and cooperative during early hours. Thornton arrived at 9 o'clock, carrying his large camera, a sturdy tripod, glass plates for exposures, and all the chemicals required for developing images on site. Having worked with many psychiatric patients, he was prepared for difficulties like restlessness or sudden agitation. But upon entering Catherine's room, he immediately sensed that something about this session was different. The light in the room seemed unnatural. Even with the morning sun coming through the windows, a dimness hung in the air, a shadow that appeared to gather around Catherine herself, as if the light was being absorbed by her presence. Catherine sat quietly in her usual chair, dressed in a simple gray cotton dress that was standard for female patients. She watched Thornton set up his equipment with focused interest, but not with a child's curiosity. It was as if she understood exactly what he was doing and why. Throughout the 30-minute preparation, she didn't move or speak. Thornton noticed she instinctively adjusted her posture and gaze before he gave any direction, as if she already knew the requirements for the perfect shot. When everything was ready, Thornton asked her to look straight into the camera. What happened next would later be described as the most unsettling moment of his career. The instant Catherine's eyes met the lens, Thornton felt an intense physical jolt, like an unseen force had passed directly through him. The temperature in the room plunged, making him shiver. More disturbingly, he felt as though he was not merely photographing the girl, but something vast and complex working through her. He opened the camera's shutter, exposing the glass plate for about 15 seconds, the time required for a clear image with the technology of that era. During those 15 seconds, he maintained eye contact with Catherine and felt as though she was photographing him at the same time. Afterward, Thornton immediately went to develop the image in a nearby room equipped as a temporary darkroom. The process demanded careful handling of chemicals and exact timing, but Thornton was skilled and methodical. Yet from the moment he began, he sensed something was wrong. The chemicals reacted in strange ways, forming patterns he had never seen in his long career. The image appeared unevenly. Some sections developed quickly while others stayed blank. When the development was complete, both Thornton and Hartwell stood silently, stunned by what they saw. The photograph was both expected and completely foreign. Catherine was there, sitting exactly as she had been, wearing the same dress in the same room. But something about the image defied understanding. Her eyes seemed alive, following anyone who looked at the picture from any direction. They possessed an impossible depth, as if the photograph had captured layer after layer behind them. People reported feeling as though they could fall into those eyes. Catherine's expression, too, was unsettling. Not quite what she had displayed during the session, yet not entirely different. It was as if the camera had recorded a version of her face slightly out of alignment with reality, revealing something hidden. As Thornton and Hartwell examined the photo more closely, they noticed more impossible details. Faint shadows that did not match the lighting, vague shapes along the edges that seemed to shift when observed. It looked as though other presences had been captured alongside her. The photograph quickly became an object of fascination and alarm among the hospital staff. Hartwell called a meeting with senior physicians to analyze the image and discuss what it meant. Dr. William Foster, the hospital's second most experienced doctor, initially suggested the anomalies were technical, perhaps flaws in the chemicals or lighting. But when Thornton repeated the session using the same setup, same materials, and same room, the control photographs appeared completely normal. Dr. Margaret Sinclair, one of the few female psychiatrists of that period, proposed a more daring theory. She speculated that Catherine might suffer from an extraordinarily rare neurological disorder affecting both her mind and her interaction with the environment. Sinclair referenced European cases where patients had shown telekinetic symptoms during extreme psychological episodes. Her argument gained weight after reviewing all the phenomena linked to Catherine. Moving objects, sudden drops in temperature, and physical effects on people nearby. She believed an unknown bioelectrical condition could explain these disturbances.